We now welcome on Jay Alter from ESPN and a WAER alumni. Jay, thank you so much for coming on today to talk to us about Coach Desko. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on, guys. It's great to be with you again, and congrats on finishing a great year at WAER.
Thank you. Thank you. It was an interesting lacrosse season that obviously has an even more interesting end. What was your first reaction when you see the news? Because we didn't just see, Desko retire, just the entire news. Desko is out, new coach in, everything with that. What first came to mind when that got to you?
So I found out because, I just finished a season where you start really in mid-August with football and then you don't end until Memorial Day weekend. So I had promised my wife and my family, I'm going to be unplugged. I'm going to be off the phone. And so I'm at a family barbecue off my phone. I pick it up. I've got like 300 text messages. I'm like, what is happening? And most of it is, what do you think of Gary Gate? Oh my God, Gary Gate. And so I'm thinking, okay, what happened here? And it actually took me 5 to 10 minutes to like dig out and realize that John Desko had retired, because everybody was so fixated on the Gary Gate piece of the story. And so my first reaction was a little kind of sad that that's how it got leaked through Inside Lacrosse, or Terry Foy found the information out, and good for him. It was all factually correct. But I just feel like a guy who's been a servant to the university for 46 years, won 11 national championships, 5 as a head coach, probably deserved to put that out himself first. So that was unfortunate. But then you take a step back and you are able to reflect on the fact that he's had a remarkable career. And, a lot of texts, and I'm sure you guys heard these, had these discussions too, is, well, was he pushed out right after the year they had? And John Desko would be the first person to tell you it was a disappointing year. He had a lot of fifth-year seniors that came back to win a national championship, to compete, to be a championship weekend, and to bomb out the way they did against Georgetown with a whimper was not up to the standard that he has set at Syracuse and helped establish with Roy Simmons Jr. So he would tell you it's a disappointment. I would just say he was 100% not pushed out. Talking to people really close to the university, really close to him, this was 1,000% his decision.
So Jay, sort of going off of that, the very first question that Coach Desko was asked in that presser was, sort of why now? Coming off of the 7-6 year, and his answer to that question was, sort of just felt like the right time. There really wasn't necessarily a definitive reason per se. From a lacrosse standpoint, you mentioned where this team is at right now. What do you think were some of the overarching reasons perhaps that contributed to the decision to make this offseason the year? Because the narrative has been there for the past couple of years. The only really noteworthy run of the past decade or so, the 2013 run to the national title game. But outside of that, I feel like people have been trying to force this narrative for quite some time now. For Coach Desko, what do you ultimately think made this year the year to make that call?
I think it was one of his most difficult years with dealing with off the field trouble. And I think at his age, my dad works in pharmaceuticals, and he decided to retire this year. He works for Pfizer, actually, because it was a stressful year for them, right? With the COVID vaccine. So sometimes you can get something to the end and be like, you know what? I put a ton of work in at my age. I just, you heard him saying, like, I'm looking forward to having my weekends. Guys at that age, they are at the point where they're not in their 20s, 30s, 40s, where they want to be grinding all the time. And I think for John Desko's point of view, I think he definitely, when they made the switch from his longtime offensive coordinator, Kevin Donahue, to Pat March, I think he probably had in the back of his head, okay, there's trouble in paradise a little bit. Things aren't going the way we want them to. Maybe I'm not at the top of my game like I was. I think that's probably when it started entering his mind. Like, when am I going to hang this up? I think he wanted to see this fifth year senior class through. He said he was more connected to these players than pretty much any other class previously. So he got them to the finish line, although it's not the finish line that he or those players wanted. And I think he just took a step back and said, you know what, I think this is time.
We're going to get into the incredible legacy that is John Desko's career, but just talking about this final stretch, how much does it affect his overall legacy that the team kind of slowed into the stop here, where they were good, but they haven't made a Final Four in a while, as we all know, and they haven't won a national championship in over a decade.
Well, I think everybody wants to try and go out on top, and unfortunately for John Desko, that just was not the case, right? I think 2013 he put together a masterful run, and we kind of got the shades of what a John Desko coach team feels like. I don't think it was a lack of effort. I don't think it was a lack of recruiting. I think he got great recruits. I think that was a bad narrative when I was at Syracuse. Oh, he's not putting the time into recruiting. No, I disagree. I don't think it's lack of talent that's been holding Syracuse back. I do think that we have seen them take steps in the right direction with the Pat March offense. At the end of the day, they just lack that consistency and they lack that killer instinct. And if you want to put that on the head coach, I think he would certainly raise his hand and say fair. But I will say, with a lot of adversity this year, I think it speaks volumes the fact that the players were pretty vocal on social media with like their support for him. This was not like he lost the locker room type retirement. You know what I mean? Like, he lost the locker room, let's force this guy out. No, I think the guys battled for him. At the end of the day, they just weren't quite good enough, and they haven't been quite good enough the last 5 years. And I think he took some time to reflect on that and said, you know what, it's time for me to step aside.
So now, let's play the hypothetical here and fast forward 20, 30 years down the line. When people hear the name John Desko, what are they going to think of in terms of associating that legacy? Is it going to be the recruiting success, the in-game coaching, the leadership qualities overall? If you could sort of, sum up his tenure, and it's obviously a tough thing to do, but what are some of the first things that come to mind?
I think when you think of Syracuse lacrosse 20 years from now, you're going to say you pretty much had an 100-year run with three guys: Roy Simmons Sr., Roy Simmons Jr., and John Desko. And for John Desko, he was part of 46 of those 100 years. As a player, he comes to campus in the fall of 1975, becomes an assistant coach, wins 6 national championships. And Roy Simmons Jr. would tell you he was more of the fire and brimstone head coach, get the guys fired up. But John Desko was X's and O's for all 6 of those national. I mean, he was essentially doing the coaching, right? The practice, the recruiting. So I look at John Desko as an 11-time national champion, an unbelievable game manager who pretty much took lacrosse into the 21st century, both Syracuse as a program, and also he was the first guy to say we need a shot clock. So I'm going to think of John Desko as being one of 3 pillars of the program with Roy Simmons Sr. and Roy Simmons Jr. from a Syracuse perspective. All 3 of those kind of 33% each. You can't put one over the other, in my opinion. And then just for the game of lacrosse, I'll probably say it for the next 20 years if I keep doing college lacrosse. Hey, everybody who loves the shot clock, that was John Desko. It really was. And he deserves a lot more credit than he receives on that front.
We get pretty narrow-minded all the times when we think about Desko because of the recency bias. You mentioned the Simmons kind of segueing into him. How impressive was it that John Desko, pretty adequately replaced Roy Simmons Jr. and he's the guy that gets the program to the top spot eventually with the most national championships.
So you never want to be the guy to replace the legend, right? That's what the old adage is, except in the case of John Desko, because in my view, and this does not take away from Roy Simmons Jr., who is incredible, one of the all-time great motivators in any sport, college or pro, but you knew it was going to be a seamless transition because John Desko was the kind of the X's and O's behind all the success in the 80s. So, you look at what the Gate brothers kind of brought to Syracuse lacrosse. Well, they had the talent. John Desko was able to maneuver them in the ways for them to win 3 national championships in a row. And then he takes over as the head coach. Nothing really changes because he kind of stayed as, he didn't move up to the Roy Simmons Jr. role and hire somebody else to do the X's and O's. He just kept doing it. He kind of had that mentality for all 40 plus years he was an assistant and a head coach. Is I'm not really going to get involved in the Roy Simmons Jr. like head of the program, face of the program stuff. He's just going to lock in 7 days a week on the X's and O's of lacrosse. No one outworked that guy. And so Ben, I hear what you're saying. Like, how impressive is it? It is impressive, but it's not a surprise because he was so ingrained in that program before he took over as the head coach. I think and this is where it gets really complicated, is you don't want to follow the guy who follows the guy. Well, Gary Gate now is following like 100 years of the guy. So, and even though the last 5 to 6 have not been up to the standard, this is still Syracuse lacrosse. Now you put the biggest name, to ever play, following legends like Simmons Jr. and Desko. It better work, because if it doesn't, where do you turn from there?
Desko became the head coach in 1999. That's 22 years, had a record of 265 and 92 during his head coaching tenure. Jay, is there a particular team or whether it's a singular year or a stretch of years that really sticks out when you think of all the teams that Desko was at the helm for?
That's such a great question. I would love to hear John Desko answer that question. I wish somebody asked that at his press conference, although he probably would have been political and said, no, there isn't. I would point to, and I think what's really, when we look back, going to be the era where he really put his stamp on the game is with the Powell brothers. That's kind of his Gate brothers in a sense. And it's funny that they are siblings too. And particularly Mikey Powell, the last of the 3, and probably that 2009 championship. Getting through the Powell brothers and then that 2009 championship, because I think maybe the narrative was, well, it's easy to win national championships when you have the Gates and the Powells. And then beating Cornell in that thrilling, they score with a couple of seconds left in regulation, and then they go on to win in overtime. That to me would probably be his most impressive championship. The unfortunate part of that is I believe it's also his last. So I think, as you said, the unfortunate part is for the last decade of his 22 years as a head coach, he wasn't able to get it done. So the first half of that, he wins 5 championships in 11 years. The second half of that, over. So, I think you got to play it down the middle and say, yeah, he was one of the greatest coaches of all time in the sport, but the last decade did not go the way that the first decade did. And certainly if you had told people that was going to be John Desko's last national championship at the time, they wouldn't have believed you. He had it rolling so well.
So that all comes to a head to ask, is John Desko the greatest figure in Syracuse lacrosse history? So I'll make a little case for you before. He was a part of 529 victories as a player, assistant, and head coach, which make up 57% of total program wins. And of course, as you mentioned, the X's and O's man for pretty much every single national championship that Syracuse has ever won. So is he, maybe it's against Simmons Jr., maybe it's against Gate. Is he, the greatest figure in Syracuse lacrosse history?
Such a difficult question. I think what's going to be, if I'm being totally honest with you guys, I think what's going to be difficult for legacy, we're talking like 50 years from now, is let's say Gary Gate has a lot of success. You're going to say, okay, it was Simmons, and then Desko kind of rode the wave of Simmons Jr., and then Gary Gate came back and really reestablished Syracuse. And it's just because Simmons is, because of this, his father, such the name that gets associated with Syracuse. I mean, they were the head coaches for like 80 years combined. So, that legacy is not getting lost. And then Gary Gate, when you say, what's the biggest name in Syracuse lacrosse? It is Gary Gate, even before he takes the head coaching job, right? He is Syracuse lacrosse, period. So I think if he reestablishes Syracuse and he wins a national championship, or if he goes on a run and wins a couple, then, there will be no one who ever touches him. It's kind of like, for our basketball listeners, Patrick Ewing in Georgetown, right? So you've got John Thompson, who has a ton of success, and then you've got his son who had a lot of success. And then you've got Patrick Ewing. It's like, even if Patrick Ewing never wins a national championship at Georgetown, he's still the biggest name, right? So I would say Gary Gate is still the biggest name in Syracuse lacrosse, and that's even before he's coached one game. So I feel, look, I'm never going to forget John Desko because I was a student and covered him. You're probably never going to forget John Desko, but the kids at WAER 30, 40 years from now, I could see that name getting lost to history a little bit, which is just my opinion, totally could be wrong on that, but I do fear that.
So Coach Desko also said in his press conference, Jay, that, he's going to enjoy the time at the lake. He's going to enjoy the weekends, but that he wasn't going anywhere, that he was, sort of going to stick around and help out whatever that may be from some sort of an advisory role. What sort of role do you see that taking on? I mean, I'm not sure how hands-on, how hands-off it'll be, but what's sort of your expectation on that front?
Roy Simmons Jr., as you guys know, because it's right next to the booth that we broadcast the games in, he rarely misses a game. So I think John Desko, he said, I'm going to slide right into, if Simmy will have me, I'm going to sit right next to him in his booth and he'll never miss a game. I do believe that. I don't think John Desko will honestly ever miss a Syracuse lacrosse game as long as he lives. I just think that is his passion. That is his hobby, is Syracuse lacrosse. So I don't think from every game that's broadcasted on TV, they're going to show Desko up in the booth, right? Just like they showed Roy Simmons Jr. So that's not going to change. What's interesting is during the press conference, he was like, yeah, I'll come to practice and yell at the guys if I see them doing something wrong. That's interesting. And I think that is only possible with the fact that they kept it in-house, if you will, with Gary Gate, and that they have a friendship and that they have a relationship. I think if John Wildhack said, okay, I accept your retirement. Hey, we're going to go hire Andy Shea from Yale. I don't think John Desko's walking into Andy Shea's practices and telling his players what they're doing wrong. So I think there probably was a conversation between John Wildhack and John Desko where Desko was kind of on that fence. Yeah, I could probably do one more year, or I could retire. I'm talking things over with my family. And Wildhack may have said to him, well, if you do retire, I think I'm going to offer the job at Gary. And I've had conversations with Gary, and I know he's going to take it. Well, so John Desko is probably thinking, well, that's great. I've got a great relationship, a great friendship with Gary. Do you think Gary would mind me being around the program? Not on the sideline, but everywhere else. And yeah, I think they kind of came together with an agreement, a loose agreement. I think it has to be hashed out. It wouldn't surprise me if John Desko is still on the payroll in some sort, fundraising, advisory, so It'll be very, very interesting to see how this plays out. But I do not think we have seen the last of John Desko.
Obviously, his role not completely hashed out yet, but at least from having him on the sideline to now not having him on the sideline, what do you think is the biggest loss for this program that John Desko is no longer, in theory, a part of, at least right now?
I think his ability to improve players was really vastly underrated. He took a lot of guys that were not the top player in the class and turned them into great lacrosse players. I think of a guy that was during my time, Kevin Rice. Undersized, didn't get many looks. He turned him into the best scorer in the country. So, and I think, and it's going to be ironic for guys like you that have kind of only covered the team when they've been on the downslope here, is for a long period, if there was a big game, there was nobody you wanted more than John Desko. He was such a game manager. If you just needed one win in a huge spot, John Desko typically would deliver the winning game plan. And he did it a lot as an assistant for Roy Simmons Jr., and then he did it as a head coach. And I don't even think that ability got away from him. Again, I think the game plans were always there. They just didn't have the consistency. They didn't have the execution. And ultimately, that does fall on the head coach. But I don't think it was from a lack of preparation or a lack of game plan. Having spent a lot of time with him, both as a student and now as a reporter, I love for ESPN, I love talking to him about his game plan. Like, no one will out scheme him. It's just not possible.
The tactical mastermind will definitely be missed from Syracuse men's lacrosse. A WAER legend, Jay Alter, helping us recap the career of a Syracuse lacrosse legend, John Desko. Jay, thank you so much for taking the time today.
Thank you, Jay.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.